Hello and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. In 1932, during the depth of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected the 32nd President of the United States. 90 years ago, in March 1933, he was sworn in for the first of his 4 terms as president. Though he came from privilege, FDR had to overcome great personal setbacks in order to follow in the footprints of his distant cousin, President Teddy Roosevelt. Joining me today is Jonathan Darman, journalist and historian. He's previously written about Presidents Johnson and Reagan in Landslide, LBJ, and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America. And now he's the author of Becoming FDR, The Personal Crisis That Made a President, a new book that explores FDR's life of tragedy and of triumph. Struck with polio at the age of 39, FDR drew strength from his illness and used those hard-fought lessons to lead the American people out of desperate economic times in the Second World War. Jonathan, thanks for joining us today, and I can't wait to dive into this book.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thank you.
Tell me what led you to write this. There are many biographies of FDR, certainly many perspectives on his life and on his presidency, but you've taken a different tack, a different approach. Tell us how you came to this topic.
It's sort of a daunting thing to take on writing about Franklin Roosevelt, because apart from Lincoln and maybe Kennedy, there's no other president that's been written about so much. But I wanted to look at FDR because I thought it would be a good way of getting at what seemed like a pretty simple but also quite urgent question for our time, which is, how does a president inspire hope in the country? Hope is a word that gets used in our politics a lot today, almost so much that it's lost meaning, but it's a thing that we really need. You know, we've been living through challenging, difficult times in this country in recent years. And so I wanted to look at Franklin Roosevelt because he's probably one of the best examples we have in the American presidency of a president who was able to come into office and form a bond with his people and convince them credibly that things were not only going to get better in this country, but that they could work together to do big things. So I wanted to sort of look at FDR and closely and understand how it was that he did that. And I thought going into this that the book would be about his presidency, that it would start in March of 1933. I didn't really think I was going to focus on his experience with polio at all. I thought it would be maybe half a chapter because I thought we sort of knew what's important about polio, the efforts that he made to conceal the effects of his disability and the sort of code of silence that existed in the press. But as I really sort of started to wrestle with this question of who is Franklin Roosevelt, I found that the polio story was something altogether different. A lot of people don't really focus on the fact that he had a whole career in politics before he got polio at age 39. And he was in a lot of ways a quite different person before he got polio. And it's only having that experience of having his life really turned upside down in the middle of life and having to think hard about who he was, what he wanted to do, and how he could get back on the path toward the presidency, that he had to sort of dig deep and develop all these new qualities like empathy and strategic thinking and this sort of great oratorical presence, all the things we associate with FDR.
Sure.
He had to sort of develop those in those years. So, you know, if he'd never gotten polio, FDR might have been president someday if the stars had aligned, but he never would have been a great president. So I realized that the best way to sort of understand how he brought hope to the country was to look first at how he found it in his own life.
And other than finding it in his own life fundamentally through that challenging, horrific disease that has largely been eradicated, and we all are thankful to have that vaccine, what about that condition of life drove him toward the presidency and not toward retirement?
It's a really interesting question because he gets polio in 1921 at age 39, and he had been up to that point, he was a figure in American politics. He'd actually been the vice presidential candidate on the 1920 Democratic ticket. And his whole sort of persona in that campaign and in politics up to that point had been as someone who did a pretty good impersonation of his cousin Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
So he got put on the Democratic ticket in 1920 in part because he made a big impression on people at the convention by jumping over rows of chairs and sort of causing physical altercations and stealing standards. And people really liked the impression that he gave physically. So you can imagine what it would mean to him to get this diagnosis of you might not ever be able to walk again unaided. Everything that he's, not just his sort of way of getting around in the world, but his whole identity is getting taken away from him. And a lot of the people around him were saying, okay, you've had this career in politics, but it really doesn't make sense for you to pursue this. Why don't you go home to Hyde Park, live a comfortable life as a country squire? There's one really important dissenting voice in that period, and that's his closest political advisor, a wonderful man named Louis Howe, who's such an important figure in the story of both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And Louis Howe had a great sort of understanding of the human condition. He really cared a lot about Franklin Roosevelt. And he understood that if FDR was going to recover from the effects of polio, he needed to have something that he could believe in, something he was aiming toward. So he said to FDR in that moment, he said, look, I know other people are telling you to give up your political dreams. I not only think that you're going to be able to return to politics, I think you're going to be the president of the United States, and I've got a detailed plan about how we're going to do it. You're going to devote yourself, for the next few years, you're going to devote yourself chiefly to recovery. We're going to find other ways to keep your name in front of the public. And ultimately, I've got a plan for how you're going to reemerge and run for governor of New York and then president of the United States. It's this incredibly detailed plan that then comes to pass. And he lays it all out there to FDR in the first months of FDR's recovery. And FDR's response is, where do we start?
Wow.
Yeah.
And Eleanor fully embraced that as well as part of the team for that strategy?
Well, so Eleanor's story is so fascinating here, and it was really some of the most, for me, rewarding in working on this. Because where the book starts a couple years before FDR gets polio. It's 1919. It's the low point in the Roosevelts' marriage. They've just had this sort of famous crisis in their marriage, thanks to Franklin's relationship with Lucy Mercer, who had been Eleanor's social secretary. And that causes a great crisis in Eleanor's life because she's not only sort of betrayed by her husband, it was a very public affair and she was sort of humiliated. Yeah, and there's the trust is completely broken down between them. So where the book begins, she's kind of lost. She doesn't have great hopes for her marriage, but she also doesn't have a sense for herself in the world. There's a moment that I love because it's so sort of evocative of who that person was. When he runs for the vice presidency in 1920, a reporter comes to Eleanor and asks her what she thinks about women's suffrage, which in 1920 is a big issue on everyone's mind because that was the first year that women could vote nationwide. And they asked Eleanor what you think, and her response was, I don't have a strong opinion either way. Personally, I'm content with my husband and my children. That's not what we associate with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right.
And in just a few years' time from her saying that, she's not only going to have an opinion about whether women ought to be involved in politics, obviously she thinks they should be, she herself is going to be one of the most influential women in all of politics with a sort of issue set, an agenda, and an identity that's totally independent from her husband. And in a lot of ways, it's polio that makes that happen. There is that need in Louis Howe's plan for someone to be getting the Roosevelt name out there in the public while Franklin is focusing on his recovery. And Eleanor steps into that void. And at first she does it kind of gingerly because she was not comfortable being a public person. But very quickly she sort of discovers that the big world of ideas and of action is the place that she was always meant to be. And so you get to see her in the book really reinventing herself in parallel while her husband is reinventing himself. And together you get to see them remaking their marriage into what's going to be one of the most consequential partnerships in all of American politics.
So when he is vice presidential running mate to Governor Cox in 1920, and they lose, he was selected as from being an assistant secretary of the Navy.
Yeah.
So in our modern times, that's a rather low rank to
Right.
pluck someone. What were his bona fides, or what were they perceived to be that would have made him attractive to Governor Cox from Ohio?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. One, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, now it is a number of rungs down the ladder. In those days, it's the number 2 person in the Navy Department. Keep in mind that America in 1920 is coming off of World War I, which was a moment where the country emerged as a global power. So being the number 2 person in the Navy Department was a high visibility position. FDR had a lot to add to that ticket. He came from the state of New York, which in 1920 was the biggest state in the country and was a sort of perennial electorally contested state in the way that we would think about, Michigan today. That was sort of New York in 1920. So they wanted to get a New Yorker on the ticket. He was associated with Woodrow Wilson, which was a corner of the party that wanted to be represented. on the ticket, and he had the last name Roosevelt. You know, it's funny to think about, but a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's early political career, sort of, he got some breaks because party bosses thought that people would, seeing the name Roosevelt on the ticket, would think either they were voting for Teddy or they were voting for Teddy's son. And Teddy was a big draw electorally. So a lot of his sort of appeal in those years was based on pretty superficial things.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And to most Americans, they think about his famous words from the first inaugural address. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which became a mantra, really. How much of that in his own mind applied to himself and his own fears about taking on the presidency, having no idea at that point that he would be a 4-term president? But that was truly one of the greatest challenging times in American history that he entered into. And so was fear a part of his calculus in his own mind about himself?
Yeah, I mean, you think about March of 1933, the global financial system is at near collapse. The banking system in the United States is basically not functioning. And there's the famous story about FDR. Someone asks him in the transition period, they say, if your program goes through, you'll be the greatest president in history. And FDR's response is, that's true, and if it fails, I'll be the last. You know, it's this sort of moment of peril, and he's very much aware of that. On the night that he wins the presidency in 1932, he has a conversation when he goes home after this sort of joyous election night party, winning in a landslide. He goes home to his house on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and he's saying goodnight to his son, Jimmy. And he says to Jimmy, he says, all my life I've only been afraid of one thing, fire. Tonight I'm afraid. And he says, I want you to pray for me tonight, Jimmy. So he did. I mean, that's a moment of rare candor for FDR. He's someone who always tried to sort of make things look easy and always put the positive spin on things. So I think he really did feel fear in that moment. But he also knew what it meant to feel fear because he had gone through the experience with polio. You know, when I think about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, I think about a letter that someone wrote to FDR, another polio patient, in the first months after FDR's diagnosis with polio was announced to the country in the fall of 1921. This was another polio patient who came from a totally different background from FDR. He was a railroad worker from Massachusetts, and this was someone who had been completely paralyzed by polio, and he'd spent 7 years in a hospital. And he wrote a letter to FDR, and he described the ways that rage and fear and shame had impeded his own recovery. And he said, Mr. Roosevelt, whatever you do, don't worry. It won't help any. And, you know, I read those words for the first time, and I could see a direct line from that to the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Wow. And do you think self-image, the image of being in a wheelchair or with walking with some heavy assistance, how did that impact him? Did that weigh on his mind, having been a healthy person in the public's eye, and then now having to keep that secluded and hidden? And why did he keep it secluded and hidden? Why didn't he use that as an opportunity to champion the cause?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I think we have to understand in a lot of ways it was a different time. So the way that people in the 1920s looked at disability, the best you could hope for in a lot of ways was to be an object of pity. People didn't understand that being physically disabled didn't mean that you were, you know, that you couldn't be fully active in all the other areas of life. So he was going up against that. And I think to his credit, this is something I thought about a lot in working on this and thinking about his relationship with other polio survivors. He got what was called infantile paralysis. That was what polio was commonly known as in those days. And it gets announced to the public. But from that point on, he could have been just an invalid, someone who had, you know, medical issues, and never really talked about the fact that he had polio, because polio was something that was quite stigmatized. People were afraid of it. There was this horrible disease, and people didn't really understand how it was communicated and what it did to you and what you could do to recover from its effects. It was very much stigmatized, and a lot of people wrote letters, his friends wrote letters to FDR saying, you're the last person I would have ever thought of as having polio. He could have really leaned into that Instead, he formed this incredible bond with other polio survivors, and he used all this knowledge that he had gained from his own recovery in trying to help them, and it was one of the most important connections in his life. And I think that's in a lot of ways the beginning of what you see in this unlocking this incredible power of empathy that he has that's going to be so important for him in the presidency.
Well, the representation of him, even as recently as the creation of the FDR Memorial here in Washington, is to how much the wheelchair would be depicted and how much it would be shown, and clearly the press events that he would have in the Oval behind the desk where he wouldn't have to stand up at a podium as we would today. So all of that in the past, and even sometimes contemporaneously with us, is managed a little bit and hidden a little bit. And I wonder what he would feel about that today. I mean, obviously, with the Americans with Disabilities Act that was signed by President George H.W. Bush and the total transformation of awareness and sensitivity in the public's mind, I think he would be happy for that and champion of those causes, I would think. But yet it was in his life, it's a shame that he felt he had to hide it or suppress awareness of it.
I think that's right. I think there's no doubt that he would be happy to see where we have gotten to in this country today. You know, in his own time, there was an interesting distinction he made. He didn't mind people knowing that he had a disability. And he didn't mind, you know, that when he appeared in public, to get around, he needed to use a cane, and he was supported by someone else holding his arm. So it looked like he was sort of walking on, you know, arm in arm with someone, and he would move very slowly. So people understood that he had difficulty getting around. What he was really concerned about, and this I think people in today's politics would understand, was anything that looked like the perception of weakness. He was terrified of falling in public, of any situation where he would have to be carried in front of people, in front of an audience. That's where in his private life he was carried all the time. He didn't mind that at all. It's that focus on weakness, and it was appropriate in the politics of the time because his rivals, as I show in the book, really tried to exploit that. When he was running for the presidency in 1932, one of his rivals, sort of surrogates, referred to him as a mental weakling, but the important word there was weakling. You know, it was this idea that he's not up to the job because of this condition that he has. And this is another moment where the sort of polio survivors are just such an important voice. I loved, in my research, I read this essay that a Warm Springs, Georgia patient, which is a course, the wonderful retreat that FDR helped to really bring into life for paralysis survivors in Georgia. A Warm Springs patient wrote an essay about this whole conversation about the president's disability. And he talked about the ways that able-bodied people thought about FDR's weakness. And he said, perhaps they fail to understand that the paralysis which has made us weaker animals has made us stronger men.
Wow.
And that's the heart of Franklin Roosevelt, and that person understood it, and I hope that we can understand that today.
Well, you have certainly covered presidential candidates, presidents. What's the difference in the press corps then and the White House press corps now? You couldn't keep such a thing a secret now. They would not be a party to keeping such a secret now. What's the difference into how press may have respected those things, may have even not covered infidelities and other things that became part of other presidencies as they would now? What's changed in that regard?
I think a lot has changed since the 1930s. You're right. I mean, one thing that was interesting for me in working on this, and we talked a little bit about the Lucy Mercer affair earlier, that was something that was a sort of open secret in Washington in the 19-teens, including among reporters. But they would never have dreamed of talking about this sort of very famous incident of infidelity in the president's life in the 1930s. And there was, as I said earlier, during the FDR presidency, there was a sort of understanding between him and the press that they would not show, him in an unflattering light. One thing that was interesting to me in researching this is there's plenty of moments where things slip through. When he first returns to the political stage in 1928, when he was running for governor of New York, they showed pictures of him where you could see the steel braces on his legs. When he was running for re-election in 1936, H.L. Mencken, describing FDR's famous 1936 convention address, talked about how he needed to be carried up a ramp to get to the platform stage because of his lameness. So it was part of the conversation, even though there was this sort of practice in the press which is something that, yes, reporters like me today would find totally foreign, of sort of keeping basic facts about the president from the public.
Do you think it also had something to do with the print-heavy press at the time versus the highly visual press that we have now, and certainly social media now? If you can see something, you realize it differently than just perhaps reading about it.
That's right. One of the storylines in the book here is how Franklin Roosevelt is able to do this miraculous thing of returning to political life and becoming the greatest political figure of the age despite his disability, or as I argue in the book, because of his disability. Because it's also this, not coincidentally, this moment where radio is taking over American life. It's exactly the same period. So when he was on the 1920 ticket, the first ever live radio news broadcast was on election night in 1920. And it was just someone basically reading the electoral results into a microphone with, like, handful of people in a very small radius listening. And by the time 12 years later that FDR gets elected to the presidency, radio is this sort of godlike presence.
He mastered it as a tool during that presidency.
Completely. I mean, that was a surprising thing to me as well, is before polio, he was not a great orator. He really relied on his physical presence. He would go do these events and people would say, oh, what a nice looking man, and he was so nice to talk to, but they couldn't really remember anything he said. He understands that radio is this opportunity for him to connect with people that he needs, and he learns the cadences. He's better than all the radio announcers. If you listen to the broadcast from when he first starts to emerge as a national political figure in the early 1930s, he's much more pleasant to listen to than the people who are introducing him and are interviewing him. He's that good.
We've had other political marriages, presidents and first ladies, who seem to be more of a political team than perhaps even a relationship team. And tell us about how their marriage survived that moment, his infidelity, her rumored infidelities, and different perspectives and involvements, and yet she stuck with him and persevered through all of that. Was that out of some personal love and commitment, or was it just the team to stay in office and maintain the presidency?
I look at this a lot in the book, and I think it's something where you really see it. There's a deepening of her understanding and her respect for her husband, and that leads her to a real belief in what her husband can accomplish. And that's happening in tandem for Eleanor with her passion for affecting change in the world. So as they're sort of reinventing their marriage, they're really finding a new way to connect with one another. Something I think about a lot is the Roosevelts, when they got married in their early 20s. On paper, they looked like a great match. They were fifth cousins, which was not that strange at the time for them to get married. They came from this sort of exalted family. They knew all the same fancy people. They came from the same circles. So they looked like they would make a great match, but they were a terrible match in a lot of ways, because they'd had these very different upbringings that gave them very different understandings about intimacy and love and the way that you should be in a relationship. And so all the things that sort of on the surface made them look like a good match didn't really help them. The thing that ultimately helps them, and this is a big theme in my book, is they each have this quite unique ability as people who can remake themselves in the middle of life. And that becomes the thing that they really have in common. And you get to see it happening, and it helps them to form this bond that is sort of based in their shared sense of mission to ease suffering. It's not a completely tidy and story, which is why I kind of love it, because it's it's messy. You see Eleanor's rage toward Franklin emerge at different points. There's a moment I love, in the book where he comes back into politics in 1928. He runs for governor of New York. It's the same year that his fellow New Yorker Al Smith, the sitting governor, is running for the presidency. And Smith had sort of, really pushed FDR to get on the ticket because he thought it would help him. So on election night, Smith's ticket loses in a big landslide, but FDR surprises everyone by winning the governorship. And it's a big sort of, Cinderella story. And so the next morning, the reporters are crowding around Eleanor, and they ask her, are you happy for your husband? And Eleanor's response is, how could I be happy when the rest of the ticket has done so poorly? And then they say, well, what do you think this is going to mean for your husband? And she says, well, I don't see how he can help but get fat. That's that old rage simmering up. And it always happens at these moments where a change in his status, she thinks it might mean a threat to this sort of independent life that she has carved out for herself.
So she has fears of her own.
She certainly has fears of her own, but she's always able to come around because Franklin was someone who was comfortable giving his wife her own orbit and expecting his own orbit from her. And also, I think she always comes around because she believes in what he's doing and in what they can do together.
Do you think, from your own perspective and your research and understanding, Franklin Roosevelt would have become president had he not had polio? And second part, had he not been married to Eleanor?
I think in both cases, he might have gotten to be president. If everything had aligned and he'd sort of been in the right place at the right time, he could have been president. But if he hadn't gotten polio, and certainly if he'd never been married to Eleanor, he would not have had the kind of transformational presidency that made him someone who could get mentioned in the same sentence as Lincoln and Washington. I feel like I know that pre-polio FDR person pretty well now, and he's just not, he doesn't have those qualities in him. It's really only through that experience of suffering and having to develop those qualities of strategic thinking and of being a great orator, and that sort of understanding of compassion and empathy, and understanding what you need to do to sustain and nurture hope, all of which comes out of polio. Those are the things that are going to make him such a successful president.
Well, I want to stay on this theme of power of the First Lady to make the president, or power of the presidential spouse to make them president. You've written about Johnson and Reagan. Let's talk about Lady Bird and Nancy Reagan and Eleanor a little bit. Do you think Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Reagan would have had that same type of pressing influence and determination and drive with their two husbands who became president?
It's a really good question, because I actually think across those three women, you have three very different models of how you can successfully approach the position of First Lady. So Eleanor Roosevelt, who's probably in a lot of ways the most consequential, I would argue, First Lady in American history, the model is she's almost an independent figure. People in the country were comfortable with her being a public figure who had her own views, in a lot of ways her own agenda, and the country was able to understand that in some ways that was separate from her husband, even though she's also someone who's an important advisor to him, an important ambassador for him. So she's really the sort of independent model. Then you have Lady Bird Johnson, who to the public eye is just the sort of smiling wife, sitting back on the stage listening. But I think what we know now, and this really comes across in the Johnson tapes and in Lady Bird Johnson's diaries, is that she was actually quite a savvy political observer.
Very formidable.
Who was a really important figure in advising her husband, and also sort of drawing the line. She did it quite sparingly with her husband, but of really standing up to him from time to time. You see it, I write about this in my book, Landslide, in the Walter Jenkins affair, which was a very close Johnson family aide who had sort of been exposed in a sex scandal in 1964. And everyone else around Johnson was really arguing that he needed to cut Jenkins loose and deal with this person who'd been a very devoted person in the Johnson family. He needed to cut him loose and be quite merciless. Lady Bird really stood up to, if you listen to those tapes, you see this woman who is not at all a shrinking violet. She is standing up to her husband and saying, this is what we believe and this is what we need to do. And then you have Nancy Reagan. She was controversial in her time. She's probably in some ways still controversial, but she was, I think we understand now that she was integral to Ronald Reagan's success as president. She was someone who understood her husband really well, what his strengths were, and also what his weaknesses were. And she was going to be someone who was going to be laser focused on making sure that there was an apparatus in his White House to compensate for that and to sort of catch things that would get into his blind spots. So she was, I think in a lot of ways, Nancy Reagan's job, when I think about it, it's the most exhausting because there were so many things that she had to be worried about at all times. Right. So, there are three very different women and three very different approaches to the job of First Lady, but I think they're all incredibly successful, each in their own way.
Do you think Mrs. Johnson was more behind the scenes in her council, and Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Roosevelt perhaps would have been more feared by the staff, knowing their two roles?
I think that's certainly the case. I don't know that Mrs. Roosevelt was feared by the staff. She actually had a lot of conflict with the staff. Mm-hmm. I think in our times, there's a lot of stories about White House staffers who sort of get crossways with the First Lady at their own peril.
Yes. Yes.
In the Reagan White House, there's the famous example of Don Regan, who was Ronald Reagan's second chief of staff, who was on the phone with Nancy Reagan and he hung up on her, which people find quite unbelievable.
Big mistake.
Big mistake. But and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had a complicated relationship. Mm-hmm. No one was hanging up the phone on her, but there were staffers that understood that she was not the final voice on things around Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was. So particularly you see this where she's really way out ahead of her husband on issues like civil rights. And she really has a lot of conflict, particularly in the later years of his presidency, with some of his advisors who were more in favor of, came from the segregationist South and were thinking about how he needed to protect his sort of political brand there. She was in a lot of conflict with them. She was someone that was respected by the staff, but not feared. And then Lady Bird Johnson, I think, was someone who, she'd been around Washington for a long time.
Sure.
And she knew it to be, for lack of a better word, sort of a tribal place where you needed to have your own people. Mm-hmm. Because, so there's Kennedy people, and there's McGovern people, and there's Johnson people, and you needed to take care of the Johnson people if you wanted to have good success.
You've written about those three men. We've talked about the three wives, but you've written about FDR, Johnson, and Reagan. Similarities, differences, strengths and weaknesses from your perception?
I came to writing about Franklin Roosevelt. Another reason I came to him originally was after having spent a lot of time thinking about Johnson and Reagan together. He's actually a common thread between Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan.
Tell me about that.
Well, we think of those two men as sort of the iconic president of the left and of the right. Johnson's the president you look for if you want an example of great liberal accomplishment. Reagan is this hero of the right. But they were actually generational peers. And both of them, their hero in politics was Franklin Roosevelt. And they each saw in him the things that they wanted to be. So with LBJ, it was the record of accomplishment. In pursuing the New Deal, he wanted to, have a record that could stand up next to FDR's. He had been a young congressman when Franklin Roosevelt was president. When FDR died, Johnson went, you can read the clips, and Johnson talks to reporters, and he's crying, and he says, he was like a daddy to me. Ronald Reagan actually got the idea of politics as something that would be of interest to him by listening to FDR on the radio. He loved listening to the fireside chats, and he would do a sort of FDR impersonation with the cigarette holder. And for him, the sort of appeal of the FDR model is you're this great performer who can form a bond with millions of people that you'll never know. And so you actually see in Franklin Roosevelt the great strengths of a Lyndon Johnson approach to the presidency and also a Ronald Reagan approach to the presidency. So in a lot of ways, FDR is, I think, a pretty unique figure because he's someone who's a great performer, but he's also a great doer.
That's very insightful. Well, we've spoken about Mrs. Roosevelt and her influence on him and with him, but there was another powerful woman in FDR's life, and that was his mother. How did she manage his illness, coping with that, supporting him through that, or did she?
She's a fascinating figure and a big character in my book. I think of her in a lot of ways as when you look at Franklin Roosevelt's childhood, she's like the 1880s equivalent of a helicopter parent. A lot of women, of her class, they would farm out child rearing to governesses or nannies. She wanted to put everything she had into raising her precious child, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Delano was pretty important because she's Sarah Delano. She views herself as having a vested interest in what happens to this guy. So when he gets polio, her husband, Franklin Roosevelt's father, he had had a long period of infirmity in the later years of his life. So she was sort of very comfortable with that idea of him being an invalid at home in Hyde Park. And she was the strong voice arguing for that. Give up your political ambitions. It shows how much this mattered to Franklin Roosevelt, that he was going to fight his way back into having a political career, that he stood up to his mother on this.
Well, did that create tensions between Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt? The wife and the mother?
There had been tensions between the two Mrs. Roosevelts, Eleanor and Sarah, that existed from the earliest moments in Franklin and Eleanor's marriage. You know, Eleanor was always the losing party in those early years. Sarah was always winning. This is illustrated by the fact that the Roosevelts' first real home in New York City, which you can still visit today, it's the Roosevelt House, was a conjoined townhouse, which was sort of two townhouses that where every floor was connected. Half belonged to Sarah and half belonged to Franklin and Eleanor. But really, Sarah is the boss of all of it. And in these years that I write about, as Eleanor is sort of finding her independent way in the world, part of that means she's going to stand up to Sarah. There's a scene that I love where at one point Eleanor actually pushes an old bureau in front of the door between the two sides of the townhouse, which I think is a great way of illustrating it. She's saying, enough.
What is the most meaningful lesson that you derived from your research and writing of this book for yourself?
You know, I think about this a lot because I think I was writing this book through the pandemic, through the 2020 election and its contested aftermath. And I would look to some of these inspirational quotes that we have from Franklin Roosevelt that are in the book, and I would read them on some of those dark days, you know, trying to console myself. So, you know, there's a moment in the summer of 1932, which is, again, in a lot of ways, a more perilous moment for the Republic than anything we're facing today. In the summer of 1932, FDR is accepting the Democratic nomination for the presidency. In his acceptance speech, he says, out of every crisis, mankind rises with some share of greater knowledge, of purer purpose, and of higher decency. And, you know, I would read those words when I was working on this. And, you know, on certain days, like January 6th, I would think, gosh, I hope that's true. Because we see the crisis all around us, but it can be hard to see the greater knowledge and the purer purpose and the higher decency. But, you know, I think about Roosevelt in the 1930s saying that, and he said those words and people believed him. And they believed it because he believed it. And he believed it because he had lived it in his own life. So for me, when I think about what's the lesson for all this, it's really a lesson for us when we're picking our leaders. When we come back to that question about hope. When we hear politicians talking about hope, I think we should ask them, when's a moment that you needed hope in your own life? And what did you learn from it, and how is it going to inform your decision-making in the future?
Well, your research and your writing and storytelling is certainly something that gives hope to where we are today and the importance of knowing history, studying history, and applying history into the future. And that's what we're about at the White House Historical Association. And I just thank you so much for delving into this with us and unpacking this story. And, you know, we all think that we know all there is to know about a certain individual, or certainly a president, as exposed as they are. But you've really shared a perspective of a man and of a leader, and not only for his time and his presidency, but his impact and influence on future presidencies. And we started this conversation talking about hope, and that message that you just shared that resonated with you as you wrote this book, I think is a message for hope that you and our listeners and everyone can take with us from this conversation. So thank you very much, Jonathan. It's been a great privilege to talk with you, and I appreciate your research and scholarship to create this wonderful book.
Thank you. It was so wonderful to be here. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. I've had the great privilege to bring you stories like the one here today since the program began in 2017. You can listen to the dozens of interviews I've done over the years on your favorite podcast provider, or you can watch them on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All of us here at the White House Historical Association, thank you for your support. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, and even this podcast. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.